Thank you, Mr. Chris, for getting the live stream stuff all set for me. Now, these past few weeks, we've been going through a theme study on grace, and we've been trying to rediscover how crucial this aspect of our faith is and what all that means. And we've discussed a lot of things. We've walked through the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, and we discussed how grace, it's a gift given to us even though we don't deserve it. And then last week, we went to the very beginning of the Bible, and we showed how God in the Old Testament does give grace, and that he even gives grace to the world's first murderer called Cain, and showing that no one is beyond God's overwhelming and abundant gift of grace. But if you remember, God doesn't just say that he gives Cain grace. He doesn't just say that he's going to. God shows it. And God places a mark on Cain's forehead to demonstrate this. And you see, grace, it's not something that we can just talk about. It's not something that we just say, yes, I'm showing you grace here. Or, hey, I'm going to show you grace in this. No, it's something you have to do. It's an action. It's something that you show to others. And this is why God doesn't just say this. God shows it. And as we move from the Old Testament into the New, we can still see God showing us grace. Even more so because the New Testament is about God's ultimate evidence of grace. Jesus. For Jesus Christ coming down to earth, his entire ministry, and even the cross, it's an enormous amount of evidence and a testimony to the grace that God has for each one of us. And the strange thing is, Jesus, he doesn't talk about grace much. And if you try and find the word grace in the Gospels, you won't find it. But in almost every action, every encounter that Jesus has, he shows grace to people in the things that he does. In Mark chapter 1, our passage for tonight is no different. So let's start reading at the end of Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 40. A man with leprosy came and knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. "If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean," he said. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched him. "I am willing," he said. "Be healed." So our story, it begins very suddenly with a man, and this man has leprosy. And he comes out of nowhere, and he starts begging Jesus to be healed. And it seems like this comes out of nowhere. But if you zoom out and you look at what's gone on before, it makes complete sense. For this comes at the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark. And in Mark, there are tons of events just like this. Just go one right after the other. Because Mark's Gospel, Jesus just shows up and he's doing incredible things. And he's doing crazy things. And people are flocking to see Jesus from all over and asking him to be healed. In the passages before this, Jesus is casting out demons. He's healing people, and people are begging him to stay because they don't want him to leave. But then he does leave because Jesus says, "No, there are others who need me." And so he goes out, and this is where this man finds Jesus when Jesus is traveling to his next destination. This man comes up and finds Jesus because he's heard about these things, and he knows and he believes that Jesus can heal him. And like so many others, this leper wants to be healed. But unlike many others, this man isn't just sick. This man has leprosy. And leprosy isn't just another kind of disease. Leprosy was different back then. And the Jews treated leprosy different than any other disease. For the Jews, a man with leprosy was supposed to be quarantined from all of society because he was considered ceremonially unclean. They could not approach God. They could not go to the temple. They couldn't do anything until they were made clean again. And if someone came into contact with a leper, then they themselves would become unclean. And the situation was so serious that the leper, by the law of Moses found in the Bible, they were required that if someone with leprosy saw someone come near them, they literally were required to yell out, "Unclean, unclean," alerting those around him that they could not approach. And you see, the only way that a leper could become clean again is if he was healed, and if he was then went to the priest and pronounced clean. And this man with leprosy, he's breaking all of these laws. He comes to Jesus and breaks every single one of them. He doesn't yell out unclean. He's not even supposed to be in wherever Jesus is. He's not supposed to be around all of these people. Despite being unclean, this man re-enters society. And why does he do this? It's because Jesus is worth it to this leper. And because he knew that Jesus could heal him because of what he had heard. For you see, if you look in verse 40, this man doesn't doubt Jesus' ability. For he says, you can heal me, and you can make me clean. He knows that Jesus can heal him. What he does doubt, though, is Jesus' willingness. For he says, if you are willing. Riddled with disease, outcast from society, literally considered unclean, this man was suffering. He was broken. He was alone. He had very little good in his life. We don't know how he got this disease or how long he had had it. But regardless, this man was suffering. And he had lost everything. He couldn't work. He couldn't talk to people. He probably didn't think that anyone even cared about him because leprosy was a death sentence back then. Because for the Jews, only God could heal a leper. And in the Old Testament, there is not one instance of a leper being cured. Not one. Many other things were cured, but leprosy never was. And so for the Jews, leprosy was a death sentence. It was a permanent thing that could never be fixed. But this man knew Jesus was different. And so it was worth it. And you see, recently, during COVID, some of us have had a taste of what this man has gone through. If you've had to be quarantined, if you've had to be stuck in your house for a little bit, it's not fun. A lot of my friends at college have had to be quarantined and have had to stay at their apartments for weeks, just alone, with nothing to do, no one to talk to. And I know that some of you have had that experience. I know that some of you have been alone, even if it's not in quarantine, even if it's just in your everyday life. We're a lot like this leper sometimes. Because we all feel alone. We all get scared. We all don't realize how much God loves us. For you see, this man doubted Jesus' willingness to heal him because this man didn't think anyone could love him. And a lot of times, we think that deep down. And at first glance, this miracle, it doesn't seem like much difference than the other miracles that Jesus has. But if you look closely at the order of events, something amazing happens that Jesus does. For you see, it says that moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched him. This man was still a leper. He still had leprosy. He was still unclean. And if Jesus came into contact with this man, if he touched him, Jesus himself would become unclean. Jesus himself would break the law. But before Jesus heals him, before the leprosy goes away, Jesus reaches out and touches this man. Why? Because Jesus loved that man. Jesus breaks past the law of Moses, breaks past all of the cultural boundaries, all of the social restrictions, and all the expectations placed on him by anyone to show that man love. Not just to heal him, but to show him love and to show him that he was cared about. Jesus touches the untouchable and tells him that he is willing And just take a moment to realize that Jesus didn't have to. There are many instances of Jesus healing people where he doesn't touch them. He doesn't even come close to touching them. Many times Jesus simply speaks and it happens. But in this one instance, Jesus chooses to. Jesus wanted to, because he knew that this man needed more than just healing. He needed more than just what everyone else needed. He needed also to know that he was loved and that he was cared about. He needed grace, even though this man had done nothing to deserve it. This man with leprosy, he was broken and he was unloved, but Jesus showed his love for him, and that while he was still unclean, he touched him and healed him of his sickness. And Paul says something very similar to this about God's love for us. He says that God shows his love for us and that while we are still sinners, Christ dies for us. See, just like this leper, we also need God. And we also need his love. And this miracle that happens here at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, it's crucial to showing who Jesus is and what he came here to do. For it quietly foreshadows the cross and what Jesus does for us on it. For on the cross, Jesus says that I am willing. Jesus says that he is willing, and he touches us, the unclean. He touches us, the sinners. He takes on our sins. He shows that he's willing to die for us so that we can also be healed and we also can be made clean. And this amazing miracle, it's beautiful. But you see, that's not the end of our passage. For Jesus isn't done with this man. So let's keep reading to find out what happens. Picking up in verse 43. Instantly, the leprosy disappeared and the man was healed. Then Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. But the man went and spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. And as a result, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter a town anywhere. He had to stay out in the secluded places, but people from everywhere kept coming to him. So after this amazing, beautiful miracle that Jesus does, Jesus tells this man, go to the priest. Go to the temple, be pronounced clean. For whenever, even though it had never happened before, there is a passage in Leviticus that states the circumstances of a man being healed from leprosy. It gives instructions on what to do. There was a particular part in the temple for someone who had been healed from leprosy. It had never been used because no one had ever been healed from leprosy. But Jesus tells this man, go, follow the instructions, follow the law. Go here, and it will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. And this is really strange at first. But if this man had followed Jesus' commands, if he had not gone out and spread the word and telling everyone, and he had first gone to the priest, things might have happened a little differently. More people might have known about Jesus and what he was coming to do. For you see, Jesus, he didn't want this man not to tell people, because obviously, as we talk a lot about Wednesday nights, evangelism is good. Telling people about Jesus is good. But there was a particular way that Jesus wanted it to be done. He wanted this man to obey the law. And he wanted this man to go to the temple so that way the priest would see. When the priest had seen that this man with leprosy had been healed, they would have known that something was up. They would have known that God was acting. This man could have been a testimony to the priest and the Pharisees who were in Jerusalem As we all know, the Pharisees were the ones who did kill Jesus. For some reason, though, this man does not listen to Jesus. He takes things into his own hands. He doesn't obey the law. And he goes out and he tells everyone. You know what happens? The gospel is inhibited. Because as a result, large crowds surrounded Jesus. And Jesus couldn't enter publicly into a place because so many people were around him. And yes, that's great that large crowds are around him. But Jesus couldn't enter into a city because they were so dense. This man's disobedience, this man's mistake, it inhibits the gospel. This man was blinded by the power of Jesus. He didn't realize everything that was going on. He thought he knew what was best. He thought that he was helping Jesus. So he took things into his own hands instead of following what Jesus had said. When in the other case, if he had followed his commands, then the priest would have gotten to see evidence. They would have gotten to see the testimony that this man had to offer. And if we're honest, compared to Jesus' other miracles, this one doesn't quite compare. For Jesus, he really raised the dead. There's not much else you can do in comparison to that. But through this miracle, Jesus, he illustrates who he is, and he illustrates that he is not only the Messiah, but he is the one who is willing to suffer and to die for you. He is the one who is willing to take on your uncleanliness. He is willing to take on your sin. He's willing to take on all of the mistakes that you've made in the past and say that I am willing to bear it all for you. And just let that sink in for a moment. Jesus, he was willing to go through all of the cultural boundaries, all of the society restrictions. He's going through extreme measures to show you that he loves you and to show you grace, even though you didn't deserve it, even though some people wouldn't accept it. Jesus still thought it was worth it. And you see, students, God, he shows us grace through Jesus Christ, through this, through all of the healings that we see in the Gospels, through all of the miracles, and through the cross. He shows us grace. And we didn't deserve anything that Jesus did for us. But God, he gives it freely. And because of God's grace, our lives should be changed. We've talked a lot about this at Winter Retreat, that our lives should bear witness. They should give evidence to the gospel. They should add beauty to the gospel. So your lives should look different than the world, for you are saved by grace. And nowhere else in the world can you find grace like that. You see, God, he has a purpose for all of you. He wants to use your life as a testimony. He wants to use your life to bear witness to the world for what he has done and what he is doing through you. But in order to give an accurate testimony, in order to truly bear witness to the gospel of grace, we have to obey and we have to follow what Jesus is calling each and every one of us to do. We have to literally become like Christ and do what he does, and to submit ourselves to God, even to the point of obedience and death on a cross. That's how far Jesus was willing to go for you. How far are you willing to go for him? How far are you willing to go for the millions of people who don't know Jesus? And you remember, students, this is a daunting task that's before us. But we're saved by grace, and we continue to live by grace. So even though it seems like an impossible task to tell someone about Jesus, you have to remember it's not on you. It's on God. Your job is to obey. God is the one who changes lives. God is the one who changes hearts. Your job is to obey and to serve him and to rest in his grace whenever you mess up, because God gives it freely, and he wants to show you his overwhelming love and his overwhelming grace for you. He wants you to experience this rest that can be found only in his grace. But just like this leper, we have to come to Jesus and we have to ask for it. And students, if you don't know Jesus, if you want to come and experience this grace that he has for you, please, I beg you, come talk to one of us. Talk to one of your leaders, to me, to Mr. West or Miss Lisa. Because we would love nothing more than to welcome you in to God's loving arms so that you can experience his grace. And if you already know Christ, which I believe most of you do, continue resting in it. Continue living in that grace. Don't work so hard to where you're working yourself to exhaustion, but rest in the grace that God has given you, for it never runs out. And that's why Jesus came. Let's think of his grace. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you for this day that you've given us, Lord, and I thank you for coming down here to earth, Lord, and for showing us grace. And Father, I just pray, Lord, that there is anyone here that doesn't know you, Lord, that they would open their arms to you, Lord, that they would come and that they would ask to be made clean, to be forgiven, and to come and to enter into relationship with you, Father. For there is nothing better in the world than that. And Father, for those of us who already know you, Lord, I pray that you would continue shaping us and molding us like Christ, that our lives would bear witness to your gospel of grace. And finally, I pray that your grace would be upon us forever and ever. All these things I pray in your name. Amen. All right, students. Mr. Jody, before we leave to small groups, we have a surprise. Miss Jody, there is a video at the end before the games. It's called Winter Retreat.